Hashtag psychotherapy unfogged with Mark Fielding.
Hello, welcome to Series 5, Episode 7 of Hashtag Psychotherapy Unfold. As you know, I'm Mark Fielding, psychotherapist and relationship counsellor, and your host. Today, I have the absolute pleasure to speak to Lee Baucom PhD, counsellor, author, podcast host, and the creator of the Save the Marriage programme. Lee has over a quarter of a century of experience helping couples and individuals learn to thrive. Dr. Baucom is trained as a therapist and coach, and he's also a popular speaker in a number of topics. Today's episode is about recovery from an affair, but I'm sure we will pull in much more from Lee's vast experience. Lee lives in New York with his wife and has 2 adult children. And I've recently read Lee's book, Recovery from the Affair, and I found it to be really good. So, so thanks for that. Yeah, it's a great book.
Thanks. Yeah, let me make one correction. I don't live in New York. I live in North Carolina.
Oh, apologies.
That's
Right,
okay.
I always kick off the show by asking our guests what personal experiences led them into the field, and obviously, Lee, say as much or as little as you're happy with.
Yeah, probably this goes back to my childhood.
Okay.
I think that's true for a lot of therapists, that we're trying to figure out
Definitely.
what happened back there. For me, I was very fortunate. My parents still have a very loving marriage, very supportive connection with each other, always have. My grandparents on both sides also had an intact marriage. So I had good models watching that. And I've got an uncle and an aunt that managed to do the same, but every other aunt and uncle failed miserably at their marriage. And what I watched was the destruction that wrought on the family. I saw the effect on my grandparents who were, watching their kids go through this pain. I watched my parents as their siblings were going through this pain. And I watched my cousins go through that, watched for a limited time because the split was so bad that I don't have contact with a number of my cousins because of those divorces. And what I realized was early on, divorces, whatever we think are well-meaning and okay, are destructive to the family, larger family system.
They are, yeah.
As are troubled marriages. So it's not sometimes we get this dichotomy of stay in a crappy marriage or get out. And I think there's that what led me to but what's the third option? That set the stage. And to be honest, I didn't realize that for a long time. So it's a subconscious or unconscious motivation. So when I was in college, I realized that I was going to have to go to grad school, and I wanted to be a therapist, which required lots of extra training, way more than I thought. And when I got to grad school, after a couple of masters and a PhD, I had rooted myself into doing some individual work, but within a systems understanding, and doing a lot of family and couples work, all from a systems understanding. So that was the beginning point. I got a little frustrated with the therapy world. And spent a lot of my time in my graduate school talking about what was wrong with our therapy models and how we could move forward differently. And so I did that. As I left grad school, I immediately went into coach training. And I also started looking for ways to help couples actually improve their relationship. I realized that a lot of what I'd been taught wasn't helping a bit in therapy. And so I began to look for what would work. And that's what kind of led to the Save the Marriage system, and has continued to be part of the work I do with couples really around the world now.
Yeah, and I really agree with you. As couples therapist myself, I think, I have to put a caveat and say every couple is obviously completely different. Couples are very, very individual, as we all are, but couples need strategies, don't they?
Yeah.
I think to sit with a couple, and it's helpful, I think, to go back and look at the generational history and do the kind of therapy thing. But I think couples in crisis, they want strategies, don't they? They want things that they can use. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think what we miss about it, individual therapy, the idea of a therapist being neutral, makes some sense. I also think that's a myth. I don't think that any therapist is neutral, but we try that in individual. It doesn't work in marital work where, somebody comes in and you say, oh, how are you feeling about that? What do you think about that? Now, obviously I'm using some broad terms there, but couples often need somebody to coach them how to get to something different. And therapy hasn't allowed that very well, or has been confused about how to allow that anyway. And so one of the things that I don't know your experience, but a lot of therapists just kind of default to this, well, let's help you communicate better. And it's the low fruit, right? And very ineffective. It's the rotten fruit in my feeling that it's down there, because what often communication for any of us is a way. You and I are communicating here. We're just transferring information, right? We're trying to make it helpful and useful, and it's just a transfer of information. So many times I'll have a couple who will come in and say, help us. Our communication is not good, and we'll sit there and talk for half an hour. And they've got communication problems. That's their, I put that in air quotes. And I'll sit there after about, 20, 25 minutes and say, the funny thing is I've understood both of you perfectly. There's no communication problem here. So it's not the communication, it's what you're sending across that communication. It's the connection that has messed up your communication. And so teaching you communication skills probably make you fight better, fight more effectively, maybe win your side faster, but it's not going to help the relationship. And so, I think that couples really do need somebody to say, you need to head in this direction if you want to get there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of helpful research, isn't there? I mean, I find myself really agreeing with that. Often couples, I think, need some guidance. They need some strategies. We're the therapists, so we look at the research. We kind of skill ourselves. So I find a coaching method, depending on the couple, is much more helpful, really. And couples generally want that, don't they? Especially if they come into therapy and they are absolutely in crisis. Now I'm going to kind of segue into the affair, if that's okay, because obviously for any couple that is an enormous kind of crisis. I'm going to ask you a really broad question, Lee. So answer it as best you can. But are there certain patterns that you see in couples dynamics that perhaps lead to affairs happening?
Yeah, sure. There are actually two big ones.
Okay.
And let me be clear. When we get into this, I get a lot of pushback from the person who suffered the affair and saying, it's not my fault at all. And so I want to be clear. I'm not saying that. I do want to say that there are two major kind of reasons for I hate to even use this term, but run-of-the-mill everyday affairs. I mean, just kind of the normal. I'm not talking about the sex addictions or the relationship addictions or, those kinds of things. I'm talking about just what is typical. And there are two pieces behind it. One is the disconnection that puts the relationship at risk, because humans really do need that deep connection. I mean, we're built for connection from birth. And so we can talk some about attachment theory if you want, but the connection piece is so desperate that when a couple disconnects, they often benignly, I say that benignly because it doesn't play out, so it's much more malignant later on, but they hit the pause button, to do life, kids, career, whatever. And so they disconnect from each other, not realizing that that's an intentional act. So disconnection puts it at risk.
Yeah.
The second piece, and so both people kind of own that. Usually in a marriage, for it to be disconnected, both people have in some ways pulled away from the connection. But the second piece is on the person who commits the infidelity, and that is that they did not have the boundaries appropriate to protect the relationship. They either didn't realize they needed it and got themselves into trouble, or didn't care to protect it because they felt the disconnection. So those two pieces are the big lead-ins. I've got some colleagues that are, they work solely around affairs, and they want to subcategorize them, and they'll come up with, 3, 10, whatever different categories of affairs. Affair is an affair. Whatever the person says, this is why I did that. They did it because there was disconnection, and they did it because they didn't protect the boundaries, as long as we're not talking about that addictive kind of stuff.
Yeah, I absolutely hear that. I guess it's often a symptom of a relationship that has just become really disconnected. And, I mean, I guess what I see a lot working with couples is, yeah, I mean, just to agree with you, really, couples, I think unconsciously can put a pause on. They have children. We think we're just going to wait. We'll resume the relationship when the children leave home. It's that kind of unconscious script, isn't it? And the couple become more and more disconnected. And I guess the more disconnected they are, the more likely they are maybe to look for attachment needs to be met, all sorts of needs kind of outside, the relationship. It's really gentle work, though, isn't it? Trying to weave that in, because I guess when you have a couple that comes to you with an affair, I mean, what do you do first, would you say? Because I'm guessing you probably don't start there.
Well, I actually generally do start
Oh, you
there
do start there.
because
Okay.
where else are you going to gain any capacity of moving forward? If you've got one
Okay.
person saying, I had nothing to do with, and they didn't have anything to do with the actions of the affair. So I always make that very, I mean, huge
Yeah.
caveat when I start. Whoever had the affair, 100% responsible for all of the actions of that.
Mm.
Both couples responsible for how the relationship was at risk.
Yeah.
And so generally, I'll have somebody who starts, very angry at the spouse who committed the affair.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interestingly, often the person who had the affair is angry about the fact that they felt neglected and all the other things. So you've got this battle of anger. And so part of what I try to put out there is that both people need to hear that both people were part of the disconnected relationship. And if they want to get back to a restored relationship, they're going to have to face that fact sooner or not later.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we spend a lot of time with the blame shifting going on of you did this,
Mm.
you did this, and that tracks us all the way back to the beginning of the relationship oftentimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
True.
instead, if we can say, hey, what do we want to do to rebuild? One is going to have to at some point be a talk about what are the appropriate boundaries.
Yeah.
But many times people don't want to set boundaries because they don't feel any connection that's there to protect. They've rationalized that there's nothing to this relationship, so why protect it? And so we have to also create something that they want to protect in order for that to happen. If you've got something of value and at some point you say, and you protect it, you lock it away and you keep it and protect it. And then over time it tarnishes, it chips away, whatever happens, you finally realize it's not so valuable.
Mm.
You're not likely to keep it locked away. You're just like,
No.
oh, whatever. And so it's the same kind of thing. We
Mm.
have to get to the place where we go, yes, that's important.
Mm.
We're going to take a conscious shift to connection. And we're going to have to also protect the relationship in order for us to not end up here again.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess from what you're saying, you'll go straight in and just really start to kind of rebuild the relationship, look at some of the patterns that were not working, kind of leading up to the affair. Something that you talk about in your book, which I really kind of resonate with couples and affairs, is the detective work. The
Mhm.
cup to the partner who is the person who hasn't had the affair. And I understand the pull, but there's almost like an obsessive pull to gather all of the information, which I always warn against, because
Mhm.
some of these things can be very, very unhelpful, I think, to the couple healing. But could you say a little bit more for our listeners around what that is? I mean, what is detective work after an affair?
Yeah, so I think part of what's behind it is often a sense of needing to control, having felt out of control and trying to regain
Yeah,
some sense of control. And information gives you that, or at least you think it's going to give you that
yeah,
sense of
yeah,
control. And so people want to know all of the details. They want to. I've heard it so many times of wanting to know when, where, how. I mean, positions, every little
yeah,
detail,
yeah,
how long, and they do this comparison thing. But what they're also doing is
yeah,
creating images in their head that now haunt them, that may or may not be actually factual, but
yeah,
they haunt them.
yeah,
And so when you are in detective mode, the second thing, so the first thing is you want control, but it's not going to give it to you. It's just going to leave you with a lot of extra information you didn't have to process. The second thing about that is when you're in detective mode, you're not in connective mode. You're
mm,
trying to catch them in a lie. And many times
mm,
I'll watch people just trying to
mm,
trip them up. And sometimes the person who's been involved in an affair, if it has any length of time to it, they don't remember the details anyway. It's kind of all blurred in the
no,
adrenaline rush of it all. And so
yeah,
they don't even remember that, which leads them, it's kind of like in a trial, an attorney, if they can't do anything else, is going to set it up to catch them in perjury, right? And
Yeah,
and they
that's right.
so it's the same kind of thing. I'm going to catch you in a lie and prove that you're
Mm.
not true about this. And so there is a basic level of information that I think is
Yeah, it's
important.
necessary. I agree.
It's necessary just to say, yeah,
Yeah,
this is what happened. This
yeah,
is how we got here, and that's what this was about. But after that, all the nitpicky detective stuff
mm,
really leads down to a dark, dark rabbit hole of
mm,
chasing the just the details. They want the
mm,
receipts. I mean, it just gets
yeah,
to be an obsession that
yeah.
doesn't get them any more connected
Yeah, and also I think re-traumatizing for the partner, the gathering of
repeatedly.
inf yeah, yeah, absolutely, repeatedly. And I find, and often couples will, will do this. One partner will go into detective work, and they need to know some information, of course, but all of the details, the more details they find out, I think over and above actually what happened, I think it can be incredibly damaging, really. And I don't know whether you'd kind of resonate with this, but the partner who's had the affair often will tend to drip feed a little bit of information because they're
Yeah.
not wanting to create more hurt. But of course,
Mhm.
that just erodes the trust even more. I don't know, do you find the same thing?
Yeah, and I think
Yeah.
that there are multiple motivations
Mm.
to dripping the information.
Yeah.
I do think that there is the I want to protect my spouse from more hurt. I also think there is the I want to protect my ego from admitting just how
Yeah.
afield I was.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think there is some denial going on, and so they don't want to face the facts.
Yeah.
So there are lots of reasons that happens, and that's part of if we can be clear, and I do think it's fair, to recognize, for instance, generally how long it went.
Yeah. Definitely.
Generally, was it physical or purely
Yeah.
emotional?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that there's a difference in hurt. There is a difference in level of that. And
Yes.
so
Yeah.
if and also of confusion of that emotional affairs, man, there's a span of gray area that people argue into.
Yeah.
And so if it's become physical, that's pretty easy to say, oh yes, we did
Mm.
this, right?
Yeah.
But there's a basic level of kind of how long it went on. Was it physical? Was it emotional? Um, what other risk factors may have come into it? Unprotected sex. There is a legitimate,
Yeah.
do we
Absolutely.
need to get checked?
Yeah.
Money exchanges,
Yeah.
or helping them. I mean, all those, there's some details there that do have some impact on how do we move forward.
Definitely. Yeah.
But after that, all those details, they don't matter. And what I think is also going on besides the control is wanting the spouse to be truthful.
Yeah.
And this is they feel like it's a pivot away from the dishonesty of the lying of the
Yeah.
relationship,
Definitely.
of the affair. And so
Yeah.
they want to go to truthful, but um, sometimes that becomes so aggressive that it really isn't about the truth. It's about the small, minute details that you might catch them either not remembering or not telling the truth about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't get us any closer to healing. That's the big thing.
No, and it's so truly, Lee, what you say. I mean, the person that's had the affair often can't remember the details. I mean, they're struggling to remember the details because, often, especially with the short affair, it's just been a whirlwind, and you kind of mentioned adrenaline and oxytocin in your book. I thought that was very, very interesting. I wonder, could you just tell our listeners a little bit around that, the
Yeah.
adrenaline, oxytocin? Yeah.
Yeah, so let's just go with kind of the broader piece there. Is what
Mhm.
I talk about. I always have noticed how hot affairs can burn compared to a regular relationship.
Yeah.
The difference between using regular gas and rocket fuel is
Mm.
kind of the analogy I've
Yeah.
often used, right? The problem is rocket fuel is dang explosive,
Mm.
and so that's it's the rocket fuel that can't last in every day. You can't put it in your car.
Yeah.
And so I say that I use the acronym of FALSE. What is driving the affair is false. And here is what false includes: fantasy.
Mm.
Affairs are bound up in
Yeah.
fantasy. It's an
Absolutely.
escape from the everyday life of, your spouse who is grubby and dirty, a lot of the time because that's life, and the kids are, throwing up all over the place and whatever else is just normal life, to going and meeting an affair partner who's all prettied up or all handsomed up or whatever.
Yeah.
And so they're on their, their best, right? They've dressed up, and you're meeting in nice locations. So there's just this huge fantasy that we get wrapped up in. Adrenaline is what we mentioned. Adrenaline comes when we have something that is exciting and fearful kind of combined, right? What do we like about a roller coaster? The adrenaline rush of it's exciting but fearful, and those combined. And so adrenaline is a powerful fuel in our system that becomes addictive. We hear all the time about adrenaline junkies, and the fact is that all humans have some level of that. They seek some excitement out. And in this case, what they don't recognize is the fear of being caught is part of the driving force. You see it in lots of popular movies, or used to be a song that I hated in the 80s was Secret Lovers, and it was this whole thing. They were hiding that, right? And I cringed every time it came on, because part of what was exciting to them was the hiding it, the people don't know, right? That's the adrenaline of that. And it dovetails into another one I'll get to in just a minute. The L is lostness. So they're lost in their marriage. They're lost oftentimes in life, and they're trying to find something that gives them something. I think humans need meaning in their life. And sometimes we substitute other things for meaning when something's not giving it that should, it's not. And so lostness, we find something that brings something back, some life back to us, right? And it feels like we found our way, but it's just into a whole nother lost area. So that's the lostness that fuels it. Secrecy, that's the compounder of adrenaline. People don't have affairs generally out in the open. I mean, it's the secrecy is generally what fuels that. And so having a secret with somebody is very bonding. And not necessarily in great ways. So you have this secret thing that's going on with this person that was secret lovers, was, we have this bond together that nobody knows about. And so that secrecy often filters into that. And it becomes you and me hiding, right? Which quickly becomes you and me against. And so the secrecy is often a compounder of that adrenaline. The last one is ego. There's nothing like somebody saying how adorable you are, how lovely you are, how sexy you are, how much I want you, to feed the ego that often has not had, and there's good and bad of ego, right? I mean, we all have ego. So the problem in a disconnected marriage is sometimes you feel unwanted, unaccepted, and all of that leads to an ego bruise. And then along comes somebody who says, "Oh, I love you so much." Now, what they're loving is the fantasy.
True.
It's caught up in the adrenaline that compounds with the lostness and the secrecy. And suddenly the ego is getting this huge boost. And that all of that is just a rocket fuel to blast the relationship, which is why most affairs don't last long term. Very few affairs can transition to a real relationship, because they're based, and the other thing is they're based in dishonesty. And I've had many people in my office, you may have too, where they are trying to decide between their spouse and this person they've been cheating with, and it suddenly occurs to them that if that other person would cheat with them, they are already layered in dishonesty in that relationship. It's built on dishonesty. And when they realize that, many times that's the beginning of the cracking and breaking away that comes from the recognition of all of that junk that's built into the relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what you say. And often I find, couples that have affairs and then maybe leave their partners, somewhere down the line in that relationship, trust becomes an issue, because they both know and they've lied to their spouse. It really can become an enormous issue for couples. And what you're saying about fantasy, I think it is so true. And I don't know whether you find this, Lee, but often, and I completely understand why, the partner who hasn't had the affair will be comparing themselves to this kind of fantasy person, and what this person was like, what they did, who they are. Yeah, and I always try and show couples it's a completely unfair comparison,
Mhm.
because I guess the people that have been in a long-term relationship share so much more. There's
Yeah,
so much more depth there, isn't it? But I guess it is obvious that I guess they're trying to find answers, aren't they?
right.
The person that's trying to kind of draw the comparison. Can I just move? What forgiveness is a big part of healing, isn't it? Could you just say a little bit around that? And I don't know, just your experience with couples, because it's quite often difficult, isn't it, to bring forgiveness in, I think, early on.
One of the things that I realized early on in my career, coaching wise and therapy wise, is how much of our issues in life are based on not forgiving. That
Yeah,
really is a question.
yeah,
Not forgiving parents, or not forgiving society, or not forgiving a
yeah.
friend, and it all leaves these remnants. And so I wrote a book on forgiving and I created a process
Mm,
for apologizing, because I see this as being such a big issue for
important. Yeah.
couples. And so let me just say that there are four things that we often put in kind of a big ball, and I think it's important to tease them out. There is apologizing, there is forgiving, there is trusting, and there is reconciling, and they
Mm,
are four distinct,
mm,
often operating separately pieces. And we think that it's supposed to go, I apologize, you forgive me, we rebuild trust, and we reconcile.
mm.
That is not at all the case.
No,
But if we're going to get somewhere healthy, forgiveness is a key part, as is taking responsibility or apologizing.
definitely. Yeah.
And of course, there is the need to figure out how to trust. I think trust is, we often make it a monolithic, I trust you or I don't.
Mm,
And that is not the case either. And so many times people get wrapped up into, I can't trust them. And so I've often had people who say, well, I can't trust my spouse anymore. And I'm like, okay, where can you trust them?
mm,
What? Well, I trust them to be good parent. I trust them with the kids.
mm,
I trust them to make the money for the household, or take care of the household, or whatever their duties are. I trust them to, um, you know, uh, go take care of things that need to be taken care of, whatever. I mean, there are different levels.
mm,
And then we start going, okay, well, if you trust them there, what would it take for you to rebuild trust here? And this is a
mm,
place, because I don't think that you can rebuild trust blindly. I always talk about trust being a gift. I can
mm.
give a cheap gift of trust, or a way too expensive gift of trust. And the cheap is, no matter what you did, I'll trust you. The expensive is, no matter what you do, I'll never trust you again, or it'll take a heck of a lot to make me ever trust you again,
Yeah,
right? And there's a
yeah.
place that's in between, of realizing that sometimes, back to our beginning conversation, when the relationship is disconnected and somebody doesn't protect it, and the trust is broken, that there may be a way back by reconnecting and figuring out how to actually have sensible boundaries in place. That often requires somebody to say, hey, I take responsibility for what I did in this affair. I take responsibility. I
Mm,
apologize for that. I'm so sorry. And the person saying, you know what? I see things differently now. I can understand that.
yeah,
And I forgive you.
yeah.
Forgiveness is not, I'll never think of it again, which I think is
No,
one of those myths,
yeah.
right? It's one of those where you keep having to work through it, but it is important.
Yeah, and I guess it remains in the story of us. I mean, the affair, it's not going to disappear, but it will remain in the story of us. And also kind of bringing, that brings my mind to, an analogy you use in the book around, which I thought was, was really, really true, around breaking an arm. That,
Mhm.
an affair once healed is actually can be a stronger relationship. I mean, I think that's
Yeah.
definitely
Um,
true. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always curious on where our different models of thinking about things
Mm,
are. So we often have this remnant of Sigmund Freud in our mind about, when we say blow a gasket, when we talk about, when we blow up at somebody or the pressure builds, all of that was based on Freud using the steam engine as his metaphor of what happens when you have this unresolved stuff that keeps building up and doesn't have anywhere to go.
Yeah, that's true.
We're not steam engines, right? And so a new one has been the computer. Our brains are as a computer. They're really not. We know that. I think that we are, oddly to put it, organic creatures, right? And so organic creatures, if I break my arm, it can heal. It doesn't have to, but it can heal. If I cut my arm, it can heal. We're naturally healers. And so when people say, you broke my heart, my question is, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by broke? Because it really, physically, that's not what happened. You're injured. You're traumatized by it. You're hurt by that. But the images, the metaphors we carry in our head make a difference in how we understand the world around us. So what if we were to use the image of you hurt my heart? You damaged my ego, my soul, whatever. But how can we find healing in that? Nature is like that all around us. We see it all the time. You break a branch on a tree, that tree will compensate and find a way to grow, and usually figures out a way of growing stronger and better. And I've got scars on my legs that are tougher than the skin around them. But in getting those scars, I also learned some things about, not defying gravity so much, and maybe being more sensible in what I do. And so the same is true. The scars we carry with us in relationships, we can use that to build knowledge, to build wisdom about how we want to have the relationship go differently going forward.
Yeah, I remember, because I guess, suffering is growth, isn't it? I mean, that's, I think, as true for an individual as it is for a couple. And if a couple can work through the affair, then often on the other side is a much, much more connected relationship, a better and stronger relationship. I'm so conscious of the time. I knew this was going to go really quickly. Lee. Tell me about your podcast. Could you maybe just tell our listeners, tell them about the podcast, and can you just tell them about all of the other things you do, your books? I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about everything you offer.
So, I mean, I've been doing this a long time. I've been online since 1999, which is, I don't know what that makes me on, centenarian on the internet, but and so I've been through a lot of the early stuff, and I started a podcast. Oh gosh, we're almost 500 episodes into the Save the Marriage podcast. It's not quite every week. I try to be every week, but it's not. About 500 episodes. I also built the Thriveology podcast that is about thriving, that I actually have on pause right now because I've been working on some other projects. But between them, I think I have maybe 850 or so podcast episodes out there. SaveTheMarriagePodcast.com is the shortcut to find that, at least that one. And I really try to talk about some strategies and thought processes people can use in order to save their marriage. And by the way, we can save our marriage at any level, right? I mean, save your marriage doesn't mean you're on the verge of divorce. It could mean that you're recognizing that you're not on a great path and you need to get on a better path, and you need to understand it. So I talk a good bit about my understanding of marriage. I've interviewed people on that. I've answered questions from listeners, and also do that on YouTube. So I've got a couple of things that are just out there. I mean, that podcasts are free. The YouTube stuff is free. For people who want to take it seriously, I have the Save the Marriage System. You can find it at SaveTheMarriage.com. I mean, I try not to hide much about what I do. SaveTheMarriage.com is just the way to get to that system. I've written a number of books. 7 books, a couple of journals, depending on how you count things, 8 books, I don't know. And I'm working on a couple now that are in the process. And SaveTheMarriage.com/books is a way to just go to Amazon and see the books. You don't have to get them at Amazon if you don't like Amazon, but it gives you the ISBN and all the other information. You can order it from somewhere else. I've also got a husband boot camp for men who want to be the best husbands they can be, working on the same thing for marriages, doing a boot camp
Mm.
kind of process, and have a lot of just other resources that are out there. But that, I mean, we take up a lot of time and a lot of confusion, but the starting point, probably the podcast,
Yeah.
savethemarriagepodcast.com.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because there is I mean, you have so much information out there. Yeah, I've been listening to the podcast, and again, I would really recommend it to our listeners. I've really been enjoying it. Like,
Good. Yeah.
I always ask our guests, kind of when we're nearing the end of the show, what their favorite strategies are for sustaining their own mental health. So, could I ask you that? I mean, what do you do to look after your own mental health?
Yeah, so one of the things that I am always so this is there's a I'm going to go into a little bit of an answer. I had actually a health crisis when I was in my mid 30s, and that health crisis woke me up to what I wasn't doing to take care of myself. Here I was doing coaching and lots of
Yeah,
other stuff, and I wasn't taking care of myself. And that really woke me up to how I needed to be better about how I dealt with my body and dealt with my mind. And
yeah,
so that crisis makes me think all of the time about what else do I need to do in order for this life to be, successful? Now,
yeah,
what is my meaning point? And so I'm constantly asking that question and reviewing it. Am I on my meaning purpose process kind of approach? And
yeah,
that changes what I do.
yeah.
Some projects that I think are really cool, I've let go because they don't feed that. Um, I also make sure that I'm active. So my dog and I take a 4 to 6 mile hike every morning. I play pickleball with my wife and by myself. I used to do jujitsu until the pandemic, and then we moved. So I put that aside for a number of reasons, but I try to find something that will keep me engaged.
Mm,
So both
mm,
pickleball and jujitsu, interestingly, require me to be both physical and thoughtful.
mm.
I can't be thinking about all the other stuff going on.
No.
And I also scuba dive, paddleboard, and a few other things just to
Mm,
stay active. And so a big piece for me of my own self-care is taking care of my body and taking care of
yeah.
what's meaningful and purposeful and staying engaged with fun
Mm.
things to do that engage my body and my mind. So that's kind of it.
Yeah, and all of those things are so incredibly important. And maybe at some point we could have you back on because there's that we haven't really talked about thriving, and we've run out of time, which I knew we would do. But maybe at some point you come in
Yeah,
again and
I'd love
talk
to.
about thriving, Lee.
Mhm.
Lee, could I just maybe ask you, is there anything that you would like to say to our listeners that I've not given you the opportunity to just before we finish?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I think is transformational for any couple is recognizing that the whole process of marriage is about becoming a what I call a we, right? We are in
Yeah.
this together. We're a team, and I so many times I see, and I think this is just the nature of our human brain that often we become oppositional. Let me tell you just a very quick story.
Okay. Yeah.
I was at a conference. And this person had us do this thing. So we were at these tables that go upward, little risers.
Mm,
And he said, okay, I want you, every other row was to turn and face the person behind him. And he said, put your elbow on the table and put your hand so it connects with the other. So both of us had our elbows on the table, our hands connected. Now, imagine in your mind, this is the arm wrestling position, right?
mm.
That's what he had us in. He said, okay, so the goal, and I'm looking at this person who's in front of me, and and I was young at that point, but she was twice my age easily and frail, small person. And I'm going, oh no, I've got to arm wrestle this person. And so I'm listening, and he says, so the goal of this is to touch your partner's wrist to the table as many times as you can in 2 minutes. And so I hear that and I'm like, okay. So I'm very gently touching her wrist to the table. I don't want to break it, but I'm not letting her do that to me.
Mm.
And so he calls time and he asks how we did. And I was aware around me of hearing this thump, 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 thump sound going on. There are about 3 people in this room of probably 120 people who had figured out that if we cooperated, we could both touch the opponent's or our partner's wrist to the table as many times as possible. And the rest of us became oppositional. I looked around while I was very gently touching her, and there were people who were
Yeah.
locked in this. And I went,
Yeah.
isn't it funny how you put two people together and the possibility of
Yeah.
when you even say your partner, that you become your opponent? And that made me very aware of what happens when two people in a marriage become oppositional instead of
Yeah.
working together as a team. What is the team going to do with that?
Mm.
And so, if there's any concept that I like to get, when I was doing
Mm.
premarital work with couples, it was the one fact I
Yeah.
wanted them to understand is they are a team, and their task is to make it through life
Yeah.
together, supporting each other,
Yeah.
joining together, and acting like they're a team with each other. How would you treat a teammate if you're, on a team? How would you treat them? Would you badmouth them? Would you try to trip them up? Would you sabotage their playing? Or would you support them, tell them what a good job they're doing, try to make sure that their best comes forward, and trying to bring your best
Yeah.
to it?
Yeah.
That is the biggest thing that I think can transform a marriage.
Yeah. And I totally agree. And when couples do that, the relationships can be really beautiful, can't they? When
They're
couples
unstoppable.
collaborate. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Okay, I don't we need to finish there, Lee, but I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been
Thank you.
absolutely brilliant, and it's been nice to see you again.
Good to see you.
And again, I'd just like to thank Lee so much for coming on the show. It was as I anticipated when I had the initial conversation with Lee, pre-podcast interview. I had a feeling that we would run out of time really quickly. I mean, obviously, as you can hear from the interview, Lee brings so much experience into the field. I was really, really left kind of wanting more. I did say to Lee at the end of the interview, perhaps he'd consider coming on again. I think Lee's got so much more to say. And also looking at kind of flourishing and looking at some of the other areas that Lee covers. I hope our listeners will agree. It was an absolutely fascinating interview. And it's an area that I've been wanting to cover for a while. Obviously fits into our relationship theme for series 5. And I work a lot with couples around affairs and trauma. Now I use a slightly different model to the one that Lee uses. I'm very influenced by the Gottmans and the Gottmans model for working with affairs and trauma. But that being said, we understandably had a lot of crossovers, and I resonated with a lot, of what Lee talked about. Um, it's really, really difficult, I think, for couples to work through an affair, but couples can come out the other side with a stronger, better relationship. But obviously there is a lot of terrible lot of pain caused by an affair, and it is incredibly painful for couples to work through that. Some couples, the relationships don't survive, but some couples that are able to work through the affair and then look at some of the relationship patterns that have not been working, bring back trust, bring back forgiveness, can end up with effectively a marriage 2.0, a marriage after the affair. Once the affair hopefully is able to go into the story of us, a marriage that is stronger. Well, I'm saying marriage, but I'm just meaning relationship, really. A relationship that hopefully is stronger. And like the kind of broken arm analogy, when the arm heals, when the affair is healed, then, the marriage can be stronger and more kind of hardy in future. Yeah, it was just as usual, I wrote down lots and lots of questions for Lee and only asked him half a dozen. But it's a very, very important subject, which I am going to come back to. I think definitely in this series, whether we come back and whether Lee will come on again in this series, or whether I'll maybe pick up the couple that have maybe worked through an affair, if I'm able to find one, you know, a couple with lived experience of working through an affair. I mean, that would also be a really, really good show. So if anyone's listening, if any couples are listening that have worked through an affair and would be happy to come on the show, then please do get in touch. Get in touch with me, get in touch with Joe. It would be great to have, I think, a lived experience couple on talking about healing from an affair. Lots more relationship stuff coming up. And next show, I think, will be relationship to wellness. But I'm not entirely sure about that at the moment. So watch this space. I'd also, as always, like to say, if you are enjoying the show, please subscribe. It helps us in so many different ways. If you subscribe to the podcast, please like the podcast. Please post your comments. Joe and I love to read your comments. Good, bad, neutral. You know, we're really, really open to feedback. And also check out our YouTube channel. As I know, I always say, the YouTube channel is not doing very well, really, at all. We get a few hits here and there, but YouTube, we've found out, is a very, very different beast. And I've only actually got the videos up from series 5, and I think maybe a few from the end of series 4. So if you do want to see the videos of the guests, then please do check out our YouTube channel. And again, please subscribe, please make comments, and please like. Yeah, and just as always, I say at the end of the show, please do look after yourselves, look after each other, and look after the planet. And I'll see you really soon, probably in a week or so, for the next episode. Thanks for listening.